think that would be an appropriate use of the dictionary as a footstool. Seuss.
Good morning.
If you need it. If you need it.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, welcome. My name is Doug Bradburn. I'm the president of George Washington's Mount Vernon. Welcome to Mount Vernon. We have a wonderful class here, and we've got students all over the country that are tuning in today. So hello to you, and welcome to Mount Vernon. So Mount Vernon is George Washington's home. It's been a special place for Americans since the founding of the nation, because he, of course, was the one that led our nation's independence fight and came back here after giving up power, and then he was the president of the Constitutional Convention and the first president of the United States, so called the father of the country in the 18th century and beyond. And here we teach people about his legacy. And we're here together on a very special day. It's Constitution Day. And Constitution Day is a wonderful day because it's the day that represents the signing and ultimately the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, which is the government that we all live under. Constitutions are the rules by which the game is played. And you're going to hear a little bit about games later today. One of the critical things, though, that we all need you to remember is that the Constitution was only possible because of compromise, because a very diverse nation with all sorts of different interests were ultimately able to get together and agree that they could live together and they would work together in spite of their differences so that they could serve the common good and find liberty and union for all. So we are excited to celebrate Constitution Day, and we're excited right now also to partner with iCivics, who we've worked together with on this great game, which you're going to get to play this game to make your own Constitution. Constitution writing is a pastime of Americans since the beginning of the founding. There are some nations that don't have a written Constitution. There are others that write a Constitution and then they just don't follow it at all. But Americans wrote their Constitutions, we amend our Constitutions, and we expect the people then to ratify and support these Constitutions. So the United States of America represents one of the oldest written constitutions that's still functioning as a major government and really gave a lesson to many nations around the world. So it's a wonderful morning here. I hope to see you all at Mount Vernon. This is a place that gets 1 million visitors a year, including 400,000 school kids, like those in the classroom and like you around the country. And so I hope to see you at this place at some time. With that, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome a good friend of ours here, the CEO of iCivics, Louise Dubé. Louise.
Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be at Mount Vernon, our great partner today on Constitution Day, and joined with 100 students from Alice Deal Middle School in DC. So, woohoo, hurrah for Alice Deal. So thank you for coming out to visit with us, and over 2,000 classrooms online. So that's very exciting that so many students are learning about the Constitution today, which happened 200 and, anybody has the answer to this? 236 years ago. The Constitution was written and signed, and there were 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, and they had a really hard job. They had to create a self-government, a mode of self-government, didn't exist before, that would sustain a new and fledgling nation. To do that, they had to overcome a lot of deep divisions. You know how you guys disagree with each other a lot? Well, they disagreed even more. And yet they found a way through it. And that requires a commitment to public spiritedness, a commitment to the common good and common goals. I want you, when you walk away from this today, that's what I want you to remember. Try to find a way through in which you can agree. The preamble to the Constitution makes it clear. All we could get was a more perfect union, not a perfect one. And the work of making it more perfect all the time, that's up to you guys. That's up to every generation. That's why you're here, to learn about how we keep that going. Today, you're going to learn from renowned constitutional scholar Linda Monk and her two special guests, George Washington and James Madison. From then, you're going to hear about the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention and all of the debates that animated the Constitutional Convention. And then you're going to play a game, Constitutional Compromise. We developed this game with Mount Vernon, and you guys are the first students to play that game. So you're going to let us know how it goes and what you like about it. You're going to learn how difficult compromise is. Some of the compromises that were made back then, we wouldn't make today. And yet we learn from that exercise what happened and how we got to be such a strong nation. Millions of students are going to play this game after you guys do. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. And please let me turn it over to Julie Silverbrook to introduce Linda Monk and her special guest. Thank you so much.
So it is my privilege this morning to introduce my dear friend and colleague Linda Monk, who I've known for quite some time, and her very special guests, President George Washington and Representative James Madison. We're going to go back in time a little bit to 1792, not too long after the Constitution was signed and ratified. So you'll have to suspend your imagination a little bit when our speakers join the stage. I'm going to provide very brief introductions. Linda Monk is a constitutional scholar and nationally award-winning author whose passion is the U.S. Constitution and the American story. Some people call her the Constitution Lady. I call her part of my gang of Constitution ladies. She's won twice the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award. It's the highest honor for public education and the law. She has a number of wonderful books about the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, A User's Guide, and The Words We Live By, Your Annotated Guide to the Constitution. She speaks and presents all over the country, including at the Pentagon, National Archives, and the Smithsonian. Her work has been featured on PBS, C-SPAN, and NPR. Most recently, she collaborated with iCivics and the Center for Civic Education to produce a great video series called The Constitution Explained that unpacks the entire Constitution in 35 3-minute morsel videos. Check those out online. They're available on iCivics.org. She is joined today by two very, very special guests, President George Washington, in whose home we now sit. And those of you online, you're invited to join President Washington's home virtually. Known to many as the father of our country, Washington served as America's first president, commander of the Continental Army, and president of the Constitutional Convention. Through these roles, Washington exemplified character and leadership of the highest order. He is joined by Representative James Madison, known to many as the father of the Constitution, who played a central role in the drafting of both the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. Though he does not yet know it, based on the timing of today's conversation in 1792, he would go on to become the nation's fourth president. It is my pleasure to introduce Linda, President Washington, and Representative Madison. Please join us on the stage. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. We are very privileged and honored today to be at the home of President Washington, along with his close colleague, Representative James Madison. It's an exciting time for our country. It's such a privilege to be here at Mount Vernon. I understand that it's designed to be the nation's capital. And I'm sure that there will be many people coming to live there and also engaging with the principles of our government. So I'm honored to be with you all today. Let's start at the beginning, how we got here. And I'll address this question to President Washington. I'm remembering when you traveled to Annapolis, where the Congress was sitting at that time, and you tendered your resignation as Commander-in-Chief in 1783, and the world marveled. But I'll let you tell that story, please, Mr. President.
Well, I am not known as much of a storyteller, madam, but I will gladly recount for you what occurred. As the war had ended, it was very important that we set a precedent and example that we were an army in the service of the people, and the people represented by the Congress. I always considered myself a servant of the Congress. And so when the war was ended, I was very pleased to be able to return my commission. And as I traveled there, there were many forms and formalities that had to be observed because they wanted to make sure that it was recognized that I was being subservient to that very body, the Congress. And so they designed and said they wished to make sure that everyone knew when we would properly stand and sit. And I returned my commission gladly, presented my sword, which of course was returned to me. And at that moment, the government knew that it could proceed on without fear, because there were many times in the past where governments had been taken over by their militaries.
Indeed, and shall I compliment you again on that rare status, because as many people noted at the time, it's alleged that even King George III made the comment that it was astonishing that a victorious general would in fact resign his commission. So,
I was very much so trying to follow the example of Cincinnatus,
indeed.
the Roman
Tell us more
senator who had had powers that were considered dictatorial. And yet he returned his sword, and so returned to his plow at his farm, which is very much so what I have done here.
And indeed, I believe that in your home you have celebrated Cincinnatus and agriculture, et cetera. So now, so you've resigned your commission. Mr. Madison was not well, he was serving in Virginia legislature and then in the Confederation Congress. And yet pretty soon it becomes clear that there are some deficiencies in the current Constitution at that time, the Articles of Confederation.
Great deficiencies.
Yes, and could you comment a bit about, I think you were concerned, you had a conference here at Mount Vernon about some trade matters.
Oh yes, we were very concerned because each of the states was conducting all their trade independently, as if independent nations. And so they were treated that way. For instance, England wanted to, we called it gaming, that one would play against another, so that one would go to one particular state and offer them one type of trade agreement, but then would have a favorable one in a different way towards another state, making contention between us. We've always said our strength was in our unity, and from the very outset of our nation, it was always the goal of those who opposed us to divide us one from another. And this was a way to do so economically.
Indeed, indeed. And as I also recall, even New Jersey was considering receiving its own ambassadors. And some of the states were not respecting treaties of the entire government.
Much as they had done previously.
So not necessarily anything new. Mr. Madison, I recall that you, seeing similar difficulties, called for a convention to be held in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786. Could you tell me a bit about that convention and what the goals were and what, if anything, came of it?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. It's a pleasure for me to see this wonderful audience in front of me. By the way, you're all invited to my home in Montpelier anytime you'd like to come. We always receive guests with open arms, and you may stay as long as you like. Regarding the Annapolis Convention, it was myself in my state-level government's legislature, the Virginia legislature, that I proposed that we meet in Annapolis. And it was actually the legislature's consensus that we do such a thing, but I suppose you could say that I was the one that asked the question.
And as I recall, that's a theme of your life, is that you are definitely the person who's willing to ask the question. So how did the conference proceed? What was?
Well, as the president already knows, it, to put it in a nutshell, failed because not everyone attended, even though they were all invited. And in Annapolis, Maryland, the Maryland contingent didn't even show up.
Indeed.
And out of the entire country, remember now, we had won the war and we were operating on the world stage, but these Articles of Confederation were rather deficient in helping us to beat Great Britain in the war. So when only 12 people total of the entire country and 5 states, none of which, as I said, was Maryland, showed up, His Excellency, the President now, Mr. Hamilton, myself, and others realized that we needed to lobby Congress to try and get them to agree to strengthen the Articles of Confederation.
Yes, and Congress was a bit reluctant, as I recall, as Congress can be. So many times you find that there are lots of complaints, but very few people willing to address the complaints. But as I recall, there was an incident in Massachusetts in late 1786 into early 1787 that, shall we say, lit a fire under Congress at the time. And I'd like to ask President Washington to speak to that because, as he knows, one of the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation was that Congress did not have the power to tax. It had to request money from the states, who then had to lay taxes, who were often loath to, and unfortunately, during our late Great Revolution, did not pay our soldiers.
Yes.
And tell about the discouragement that caused and how that leads up to what becomes known as Shays' Rebellion.
Yes, well, it was the unfortunate truth throughout the war that it was very rare for our soldiers to see payment. And of course, Congress had issued bills of money that they were not backed by either gold nor silver, and so they very quickly became almost worthless. You could trade one silver dollar for more than 100 of the continental dollars. But even then, payment was not given to soldiers. The officers did not see payment for the final 3 years of the war. And so there were many who returned to their farms after that revolution without seeing any recompense for their service, which created a great difficulty. And as our economy began to move forward, there were great difficulties with where money was owed. Many of these farmers had said that they would promise their land and they would sign their names to papers that said that they would give their land if they did not make good on what they were borrowing. And so they borrowed so that they might continue their crops. And then above them, those merchants, they were borrowing money from England. And so England then put pressure upon the merchants that they must collect their money, and then the merchants began to put collections against the farmers, whom I very much so empathize with their situation, having been in debt myself previously as a farmer.
May I ask, my understanding is that's how most farmers have to stay in business, is to take upon debt to finance their crops.
Hoping that the next year's crops will make up the difference.
The original gamblers.
Indeed, very much so. And of course, we are all dependent, are we not, upon our farmers, because they are providing the very sustenance of life that we all expect and need to be able to purchase, even if one is far from farms themselves and in the city. And so they found themselves now losing the farms, the very things that they had hoped they would be returning to, what they were fighting for throughout the war. And now, as their farms were being lost, they began to march against our institutions, as in our government buildings and courts.
Right. I will say my sympathy is definitely with the unpaid veterans. I have a bit of pride of country here because, as you mentioned, the merchants of Boston, ironically, are in debt to the English merchants, even though we've just won a war to defeat them. But if those debts aren't repaid, the credit of the United States is worthless, and then there's no economy.
And so there's no situation moving through this where you can see a victory for our nation, which was already just in its infancy, just beginning.
And I believe, as you said very early on, and after this incident, that if you want to have self-government and you take upon that role, then it's also your responsibility to obey that government.
Indeed.
So it's the counterbalance to liberty.
Indeed.
And again, my sympathies are with Captain Daniel Shays and his colleagues who were veterans who had not been paid, in my opinion, by the cowardice of our Congress. I can say that now that we have a First Amendment and not be accused of treason. And it was this difficult situation for the very people that had borne the brunt of the battle were now not being paid and were losing their farms, which meant that they would have nothing. But out of that came a sense of we do need a stronger government. We do need a different form of government. And I believe that's, Mr. Madison, in fact, you had been doing some study for quite some time about what is the best form of government, which one would we want, assuming we can choose. Alexander Hamilton said that the American people have the great good fortune of, for once, being able to choose their form of government and not have it thrust upon them. What do you say, Mr. Madison?
Oh, indeed, that is the case. In my studies, I endeavored to take on a rather large project. You may or may not know that my good friend is Thomas Jefferson, who lives a mere day's ride south of me in his estate called Monticello. And he opens his doors as well to visitors. But he was in France at the time, you see. And he always encouraged me to come over. And I never did make it over there, but I did make a request because I knew Paris was a city that could be counted on for all kinds of commodities and culture and any manner of material objects and other things. So I made a very specific request. Mr. Jefferson, could you please secure for me as many books as you could find on republics, democracies, confederations, anything that did not represent some kind of overbearing monarchy, a despot, an emperor, a dictator, all those things that we wanted to stay away from. And I endeavored to make a very large study about that, which became so large because it's hard to believe, perhaps, but you can get anything in Paris. President Washington. And 2 trunkloads of books landed on my front doorstep in Montpelier, and inside were a total of 200 books on those subjects. Mm-hmm. Well, you can see that there's a book right beside my chair, and that is something that I enjoy very much doing. I don't have too many hobbies. I like to read that much. And
indeed, I saw a note from you when you were staying in Philadelphia, and you were asked perhaps to move to nicer rooms. But you commented that your books were stacked to the ceiling, all about the room. We might, some people might say a little bit of a hoarder, except I've read that it's impossible to hoard books. Books are the exception. Anyway, that you declined the nicer quarters because your books were all packed to the ceiling all around, and you never find them if you tried to move. So
oh yeah, it was my own catalog, my own catalog version. But I did endeavor to make a very large study on the matter and came to a conclusion that we had to do something quite drastic, because none of the previous confederacies, republics, or democracies ultimately survived. And the world only knew one kind of government system that actually worked: a monarchy. Now, that would be if it was a benevolent or good monarchy. You can have good kings and bad kings and good queens and bad queens. But if you had a benevolent monarchy, that's the striving that the world was really going for. And we were completely opposed to that. We wanted to return to some of the philosophers, excuse my pronunciation, from back to Greece and Rome, and then some of the other confederacies that had come along the way.
And I believe you concluded after all this study that indeed a republic was the best form. A republic defined as a system of government that ultimately depended on the people for its authority and its say. Did I say that correctly?
Yes. There was a word that was thrown around quite often called democracy, but we are not technically a democracy at this time. And we have some democratic principles written into the Constitution, which we will soon get to. But we are actually a representative or a constitutional republic, are we not, President Washington?
Indeed, sir.
Well, and I would add, there are those who would say it's not a democracy in terms of direct democracy, but the term is also used, a democratic government. This one we can say we have a democratic republic or a constitutional republic or a constitutional democracy. But we know that the framers themselves were not fans of the word democracy. They associated it with,
Fans, madam?
I'm sorry?
Fans?
Yeah,
Are there any ladies in the room that are a little too hot?
fans, proponents,
Oh,
adherents,
yes, I see. Admirers of-
devotees.
Yes, very well, I understand.
Thank you for translating for me. But so we now have had Shays' Rebellion. We have had Mr. Madison do quite a lengthy study.
But you have to recall, madam, that even while he was doing the study, there were people that were proposing forms of government that had never been heard of before. I received a letter from a colonel who said that it was clear that the republic that we had formed in the Confederations
And the Confederation, which,
had failed. And so he said, we must now have an elected monarchy,
or as Mr. Jefferson would say, a Polish king.
which is something that I find very absurd.
Indeed, and let's travel to Philadelphia if we may. I see that our time is always the enemy of good conversation, but so Congress, after Shays' Rebellion, has decided, yes, we must at least amend the current Articles of Confederation.
It's amazing how soldiers in the field will make Congress feel that they must take action.
Indeed, indeed. A little rebellion now and then. The question is when the rebellion will stop. So the convention is called in May, and it's held in Philadelphia, as our speaker said previously, 55 different delegates. And I believe you had some reluctance about attending.
There was no guarantee that such a thing would succeed, but further than that, I had resigned from public life. And so it might appear, if I were to partake in such a thing, that I was now reaching to return to power, which is something one must always be wary of. Any person who is reaching or seeking power, which is quite a seductive form for many people.
And indeed, and that was a consistent theme of your public and private life, and one that I hazard future generations will continue to admire. Now, Mr. Madison, why did you think that it was essential for, at that time, retired General Washington to attend the Philadelphia Convention in May?
Well, to put it quite succinctly, madam, I think the country, that was the single most lauded person that everyone could universally rally around. He was rather universally popular for pulling off this event. No offense to France, who gave us incredible help. Let's not reduce that contribution that they made. But amongst those of us that were trying to convince Congress to reconvene in Philadelphia to improve these articles, I and Mr. Hamilton and other people of a stronger national government mindset thought that in order to wake everyone else up, that His Excellency's presence was absolutely necessary.
It was essential. In fact, many people will refer to President Washington now as the indispensable man, in the sense that, yes, there are many great men, but great men don't accomplish things alone. And yet, you must have someone that can unify the country, and President Washington did that admirably. So let's turn to the convention in Philadelphia. It's a hot summer, with an infestation of black flies.
Yes.
The men are all wearing wool suits with no deodorant and no air conditioning. So, and as I recall, Mr. Washington at the time insisted that the windows be closed because it was to be a secret convention.
It was important that we maintain some level of secrecy, madam, so that people would not, that were within the Congress, would not feel that they were performing, as it were. And also,
Even though they were. But
I suppose some. And then, but also, the great fear, of course, would be that someone would hear what we were arguing or discussing, and that they would wish to sway that argument, or perhaps even say, if this is within the Constitution, I will agree to it, or will absolutely not agree to it. And that might not actually be something that survived until the end of our discussions.
yeah. I note that you, of course, were voted unanimously to be the president, and that was a different word at that time. It tended to be more like the head of your social club.
Well, we had certainly had plenty of presidents of Congress previously.
Yes. That you were chosen by the delegates unanimously to preside, and yet, ironically, throughout the convention, you speak very little and only toward the end. And it reminded me that now your vice president, John Adams, had said of you that you possessed the gift of silence. So I'm wondering if you might share with us your thoughts about how silence is important, particularly when you're trying to get people to agree to something.
Well, my position as president made it so that I felt that anything I said might have more weight than others. And so if I did need to vote, for instance, I stepped down from that position and put another in that chair temporarily. But I've found, madam, that if one is in a room full of brilliant minds, it is best to remain silent and let them think that you are one of them, rather than to open your mouth and convince everyone that you are not. But also there's so much that must occur that we hear one another. And you cannot hear what people are saying if you are too obsessed with the idea of pushing forward your own ideas. And we can only come to a true place of compromise if we understand what it is the other person is attempting to do.
So that was the core, really, of the convention being able to compromise, is you, I think, modeling what it was like to be a good listener.
Well, if you look around the room today, we have many faces before us.
Yes.
And I would imagine there are as many different opinions as there are faces. Why should we not, as Americans, we are, after all, a united country. And so because of that, we must all be willing to listen to all of our citizens.
Yes. Well, Mr. Madison, you become a revolutionary at the start of this convention because you're sent there to amend the Articles of Confederation. And yet, right away, you propose a radical proposition known as the Virginia Plan. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I felt that it was apropos because, in fact, if I may take a little liberty, His Excellency President Washington of the convention at the time wrote me a letter before we even attended,
Indeed.
stating, if I remember as close to verbatim as possible, that we probe the defects of the Constitution to the bottom and provide radical cures, which was contrapuntal, fancy word, you can look it up in my dictionary if you'd like. The newest edition, 1755, Samuel Johnson, opposed to what the Congress wanted to allow, which was a mere revision. They gave us permission, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the existing system. But it was His Excellency, myself, and others that thought that that would be completely and wholly inadequate and a waste of our time, quite frankly. So we must get to the business at hand and create a strong enough government where we can not only stand on the world stage, but remain there.
Yes. And as that plan is presented, there are many other proposals. We're going to focus today on two of the key compromises at that convention, two critical issues that continue to be an issue for our country today, and upon which I think our audience will have a lot of concerns. The first issue is, in the Articles of Confederation, everybody was equal. Little Rhode Island and big New York had the same vote. So you can imagine in a family of 13 brothers and sisters, if suddenly some brothers or sisters want to have more power than the others, they're not equal anymore. Mr. Madison is saying, wait a minute, the state should be represented on the basis of population. And that's going to give Virginia and some other states much more representation. Now, as you recall, in American history, there are states, we'll have a state called California that has a lot of people, et cetera. Imagine if all of those people in California only had one vote in the Congress, the same as Rhode Island that had very, very few people. And the other issue is with taxation. It's like representation in government also comes with a tax. You have to pay more taxation. So keep those two in mind. First, let's solve the issue of the states. Mr. Madison, how are the states going to be represented in this new government?
Well, that, again, was a compromise, and if I can say that President Washington might agree that none of us got the final product that we originally wanted, because as Mrs. Monk mentions, I was a proponent of proportional representation throughout the legislative body, whether it be the House of Representatives or the Senate, being of a much more Republican way and a better representation of the people themselves. And I got outvoted on that, but there was a compromise made from a gentleman from Connecticut, two actually, but the main author is the name of Roger Sherman, and he, along with Oliver Wolcott, proposed, I think it's Oliver Ellsworth actually, there's two Connecticut Olivers, and Wolcott was with the Articles, but Oliver Ellsworth proposed that, well, let's balance that out. Since we have a bicameral legislature, let's...
Two houses. Bicameral means
two houses, correct, that let's make everyone happy as much as possible. So let's give Mr. Madison what he proposes, proportional representation in the lower house, in the position that I hold now as congressman, and in the upper house where the Senate sits, we'll give equal representation. And that was a great equalizer in the room where we were deliberating.
That's a situation of a very positive compromise.
And as I'm sure you would say, essential to the Union.
Indeed.
There was as you've said many times, the concern was the bringing the Union together. And on that light, the other large compromise that we must address, and that our nation, I believe, continues to address, is how do we call ourselves a nation based on liberty, and yet so many of our fellow people are enslaved? And that becomes a very controversial issue. The question is, how shall enslaved people be counted? For instance, if you count an enslaved person as the entire number of enslaved people, does that end slavery? No. At the time of the Constitution, the southern states, along with New York and New Jersey, still hold slaves. The northern states are pretty recent to abolition. And it becomes an issue for the economy of the entire nation, because whether or not a state holds slaves, the rest of the country is enmeshed in slavery deeply, whether it's through debts, where enslaved people are used as collateral, whether it's through providing services or crops that are then used by northern industry, whether it's insurance, whether it's slave ships. The important thing to remember is that slavery is deeply enmeshed, not an excuse, not a justification, a fact that slavery is deeply enmeshed in the economy of the United States, deeply.
And those southern states, especially, they were claiming that they wanted to have every slave counted so that they might be represented.
Right.
But would those people be able to vote?
No. Indeed, women, children, Native Americans, none of them were, men without property.
Indeed. And so we said, oh, so you do not wish to acknowledge them as, you want them to be acknowledged as people. And they said, well, no, they are property. And we said, well, now if they are property, then they do not count towards your complete power. And we knew that this was going to continue to be an issue. They were very aware that there were already leanings, and there were many different of the states that were already proposing a manumission of slavery so that it might gradually be eliminated. And they wished to delay that as much as possible. And so they said that under no circumstances would they agree to this Constitution if we did not find some other way to compromise, where they wished, as I said, to count everyone as a person only for the purposes of their own power and vote, which would mean we would never see an end to slavery were they to have their way.
And I believe one of the delegates at the convention said, Mr. Mason, as I recall, that because tobacco, which was the principal crop upon which slavery was based, the slave system was used, was diminishing. And so that they had a hope that slavery would be abolished. Mr. Madison, I believe you came up with the compromise, which is that the Constitution always refers to persons and never refers to persons as property. And yet when those persons are counted that are held to contract, what is your resolution there?
Well, the first thing that I'd like to point out is that the concept of slavery was brought up very early in the convention. In fact, the first time that I spoke about it myself was June the 6th, and don't forget, Mrs. Monk had said that the convention began in late May. And what happened was that it got pushed aside. We tried to address it immediately at the beginning and talk about the abolition of the practice. Even Mr. Jefferson did in the Declaration of Independence. But unfortunately, and personally, I must say that I'm quite the pragmatist. I think His Excellency the President would agree, a working politician, and what we needed to move towards was a gradual emancipation solution. We were never in a position, any of us, that wanted to do anything but emancipate our enslaved peoples, but we had to create a system where it would be done gradually moving forward. And it is in the Constitution that says that the first thing that we wanted to get rid of was the slave trade itself. So the compromise that Mrs. Monk is specifically referring to is that the people that were involved in the enslaved duties would be counted as 3/5 of a person.
Right. Well, and the 3/5 of the total number would be counted, because the irony is that, yes, counting the full number gives more representation to slaveholders in Congress, but if you don't count the number at all, then the southern states don't have to pay their fair share of taxes.
Indeed.
So I see time as our enemy again, tick-tock. I want to refer to one last compromise, and I'm afraid you'll have to discuss it with the audience privately, but there is no Bill of Rights when the Constitution is signed in September 17th. And it causes quite a dilemma, because as you know, when the Constitution is signed, it doesn't just magically poof, fairy dust, turn it into government. No, they have to go back to the Congress that sent them there and say, oh, sorry, we didn't do what you told us to. We did something entirely different. Congress decides not to weigh in, but it does allow the states to go forward. So from my view as a constitutional scholar, that means there was not a coup. There was not a coup because these gentlemen didn't ride out on their horses saying, and the new government begins. No, they gave it back to Congress, much as General Washington returned his commission, And then the people in the ratification conventions voted. And guess what? One of the things that they voted on was whether or not they wanted a Bill of Rights. And that then becomes, I'm having to wrap up here, that becomes the issue in the first Congress. Mr. Madison is elected to the first Congress. And as his opponent, James Monroe, he was able to tell the people, you know what? The Bill of Rights, I was against it at first, but you know what? Bill of Rights, Schmill of Rights. If you want a Bill of Rights, I'll give you a Bill of Rights. And as he says later, and I'll leave this last line with Mr. Madison, your reason for changing your mind on supporting the Bill of Rights was?
Well, this is the formal one. It was to prevent a second convention.
Well, that's true. Mr. Madison I admire because he's the practical politician.
I am a practical politician. It was to prevent a second convention, but it was also to express the fact that we were a representative or democratic or constitutional republic.
And I remember, as you said to a friend, you said the reason was, and General Washington has expressed this before too, because I am an honest man. You had promised your constituents. How many representatives do you know of today that may make promises in elections but don't necessarily deliver when they get in office? Mr. Madison did deliver, and I'm proud to say, General Washington, if you have some final thoughts about our new government as it begins.
Most importantly, that if the American people, as the years come on, are not fully free and happy, it will be your own doing, because this is a government that is made by people. And so it is not been handed down from a monarch, but it is within your power to shape it and to continue to follow it. We have designed it as best we could with its imperfections, because we knew that human nature, as it is, would continue on. And so hopefully you will be able to preserve that union that has been so carefully forged and so long fought for.
And it's your responsibility to propose amendments. Remember, we can criticize the framers for what they didn't do that we think they should have done. And remember that every generation after the framers had a chance to abolish slavery, to treat Native American nations better, to allow women and younger people to vote. So on those words, I'll say thank you very much. It's been a delight and pleasure.
Pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you.